Okay, grade 8, this is your Monday morning forfer. I couldn't have chosen a more difficult forfer to start off on a Monday morning first period, but here we are. So we have 4 questions. The first question says, what is the perimeter? And it gives you this weird looking base of x plus 3 and a height of 4. So we know that the formula for the area of a triangle is base times height divided by 2. And since we know that equals the area, I could write my formula like this. So base times height divided by 2 equals area. Now actually, if we substitute everything we know into this formula, and we have a base of x plus 3 and a height of 4, we could go x plus 3 multiplied by 4. But since we always said that if we have what we call a binomial, which is 2 terms, times a monomial, it's always good to reverse those so you have your monomial first. You don't have to, but height times base or base times height doesn't matter. Divided by 2 equals the area, which we already know is 22. So what we've really done here is we've substituted into the formula everything we know, and we've ended up with this difficult looking algebraic equation. Well, since I'm dividing this side by 2 right here, this is what this means here, dividing by 2. Instead of dividing by 2, I'm going to multiply this side by 2, and I'm going to multiply this side by 2. Okay? We've done this before with different questions, so we understand if we're dividing a side by 2 and we multiply it by 2, it gets rid of that. I end up with 4 bracket x plus 3, which means 4 times x plus 3 equals 44. Now that we're here, we can do it a couple of different ways. We can expand or we can use division first. I'm not going to use expansion or division first. I'm going to expand. So if I have 4x plus 3s, and I'm just going to draw x plus 3. There's an x, and there's a plus 3. So if I had 4 of those, I could take my infinite cloner tool here, infinite cloner, and I could quadruple it. 1, 2, 3, 4. And essentially what this means here is you're multiplying x plus 3 times 4, which would give you this. So if I was drawing it, I could clearly see that's 4x plus 12. But the way we do that is we take our 4 and we multiply it by our x to give us 4x, because that's what a coefficient does. It multiplies a variable. So 4 times x would be 4x, or 4 times x. And 4 times 3 would be 12, or plus 12, or positive 12. So when we expand that, we end up with, instead of 4 groups of x plus 3 equals 44, we end up with 4x plus 12 equals 44. And now we have a grade 7 algebra question where we can subtract 12 from both sides. We get 4x equals 32. Divide both sides by 4. And we figured out that x equals 8. Now that's important, because the question was, what is the perimeter? And the perimeter is the distance all the way around this triangle. So if we know x is 8, I can substitute the x right here for 8. And now I know that that base is not x plus 3, but the base is really the number 11. Right? I can change that x plus 3 to 11 because I know that x is 8. And once I know that, the perimeter will be 8 plus 10 plus 11, which will be 29. So therefore, the answer to the question, what is the perimeter? The perimeter would be 29 meters. Okay? Question number 2, same idea as the last question, but actually a little bit easier because we're just dealing with a rectangle. So here we're going to write down our formula. Length times width equals area. Okay? So now we have a length and a width of 5 and x plus 3. And just like the last one, if you're going to multiply 2 together, always put your single term first. Call that the length. And we'll call this the width. And we'll call this the area because it's already given to us. So when I substitute what I know into the formula, I end up with a distributive property equation of 5 times x plus 3, or length times width, equals the area that was given of 26. Now here I'm going to expand. I'm going to get 5x plus 15 equals 26. I'm going to subtract 15 from both sides to get 5x equals 11. I'm going to divide both sides by 5. And some people say, well, you can't do that. You can't divide 11 by 5. Well, you can. It's just a decimal. So I'm going to think of it, I'm not going to use my calculator. I'm going to think of it as a mixed fraction, which would be 2 and 1/5, which is the same thing as 2 and 2/10, which therefore is the same thing as 2 and 2/10. If you don't believe me, you can grab your calculator and check out for yourself. 11 divided by 5 is 2 2/10. Right? So sometimes for those of you who want to really think this one through without a calculator, think of these divisions as being improper fractions. Convert them until you can read it as a decimal and then write it. So now I know that x is 2.2. So again, just like the last one, I'm going to take my x, I'm going to erase it, and I'm going to put the actual value of x, which is 2.2. And once I put 2.2, then I know the length is not that, but it's actually 5.2. And when I add all those sides together, 5.2 plus 5 plus 5.2 plus 5, I'm going to get 20.4 equals the perimeter. And usually don't get easier as we go through these questions, but we are going easier as we go through because the next question is fairly simple. It says, write this in two ways. So if I interpret what this model says, if I never taught you distributive property before and I said, what does this model say? Most of you would have been able to say it's 6 plus 2 more x's is equal to negative 8. And that is one way to write it. But the other way to write it, which connects to what we said before, which is distributive property, is we have two groups of 3 plus x. We have two groups of 3 plus x, which is two groups of, which means multiplication, 3 plus x, and that is going to equal negative 8. So one way to write it was in the pre-expanded form, and the other way we could write it is looking at it as groups of a certain amount of algebra tiles. And this one we can clearly see it's two groups of 3 plus x. There's one group there, and there's the other group there. So we can say two groups of 3 plus x equals negative 8. And the last question in our for is expand or use division first. I'm going to do both. So I'm going to take this equation, and I'm going to do it both ways. So I'm going to, oh, that's not right. I'm going to bring it over here. Oh, no, not. I'm going to. So here I have it two different ways. All right, so two groups of 2x minus 1. And remember, if I had two groups of 2x minus 1, there's one group of 2x minus 1. And there's two groups of 2x minus 1. So pictorially, if you ever get confused, just draw it out and say, well, that's two groups. Oh, I see what it is. It's 4x minus 2. Because most people can see it when they draw it out. But sometimes you don't see it when you try and use the arrows. But if I had two 2x's, that would be 4x's. If I had two minus 1s, that would be minus 2. And when I expand using distributive property, I end up with this two-step equation, which is from your grade 8 textbook. I would add 2 to both sides to get rid of your constant. I'd end up with 4x equals negative 8. I would divide both sides by the coefficient, leaving me with x equals negative 2. The other way you could have done it is division first. So the first thing I'm going to do, I have two groups of these. So instead of having two groups, I'm going to divide that entire side by 2 to end up with one group of 2x minus 1. One group. Instead of two groups, I have one group. But if I divide that side by 2, I must divide that side by 2, and I end up with this equation. So instead of saying two groups of 2x minus 1 equals negative 10, I can say one group of 2x minus 1 is equal to negative 5. And then when I isolate, 2x will equal negative 4, and x will equal the same answer I got over here. I just took a completely different pathway to isolate the variable.